I'm Mia, and I'm 32 years old and a teacher by profession. It feels weird to introduce myself at this point because I'm going to talk about the worst chapter of my life. The kind of mistake that no matter how much you regret it, you can't erase or undo. I don't tell this story lightly because the guilt it brings is like a weight pressing down on my chest every day. I know there is no redemption here and no way to take back what I did, but maybe sharing it and putting my story into words will help me release some of the burden I'm carrying around. Their heart and their impulses in check. I've always considered myself a simple woman. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew you and expected you to succeed and live up to the mental image they had of you. I went to college, became a teacher, and gave my all to my students, believing in the tiny difference I could make in their lives. At that point, I met Danny, who was unlike anyone I had ever met. He was a charming, driven businessman. We came from two different worlds, but somehow that was what drew us together. Our marriage was a promise of two lives combining into one, a fusion of my more reserved aspirations with his audacious plans. His family, though, didn't always understand or support our connection. I could sense their reservations and unspoken disapproval, wondering why he'd chosen me. I wasn't from his world of refined, wealthy circles. I was the daughter of a grocer and a hairdresser. His parents were courteous and always civil, but there was a certain distance and a reserved detachment that made me uneasy. Nevertheless, I ignored those emotions and chose to concentrate on creating a life with Danny, believing that love could fill gaps and silence doubts. After our wedding, we moved into his family's beachfront estate, which was stunning and almost intimidating. It had expansive gardens, sleek marble floors, and spacious rooms with high ceilings. It was very different from my parents' modest house, but Danny gave me the impression that Danny traveled frequently, meeting clients, attending conferences, chasing the next big deal, and each time he left, the house felt empty, larger, almost echoing with the loneliness that crept in when he was gone. The only constant in those long, quiet stretches was his father Richard, who was always around. I wanted to believe that house became ours, so I did my best to make myself at home with his constant encouragement, but as the months went by, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was a stranger within those walls, a guest in my own life. Long before he became a real estate tycoon, he had been a teacher himself. He told me stories about his early days teaching history, how his students would lean forward with wide eyes during tales of ancient wars and forgotten heroes. He was older, yes, but he was warm, approachable, and sympathetic in a way his wife wasn't. With each story, I saw a softer side to him, a side that made me feel seen and heard in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The first time I truly opened up to Richard was after a challenging day when one of my students was having trouble, and I had spent hours after class trying to help her. I came home exhausted and feeling a little defeated, and Richard found me in the kitchen drinking tea and looking out at the ocean. He sat down next to me, and I didn't even realize how much I'd been holding inside until I started talking. I told him about my student and the frustrations of teaching in a school with inadequate funding. He listened, nodded, and even shared a few stories from his time as a teacher. His words were reassuring, telling me that my efforts were important and that I was helping in ways I couldn't always see. I was thankful for him because I hadn't felt that kind of support since coming here, and his kindness turned into a balm on days when the loneliness got too loud. Over time, these moments became routine and an anchor in my otherwise perfect life. After everyone else retired, Richard and I would stay up late for dinner and coffee. We would discuss everything from politics to education to history to personal beliefs. I began to look forward to those conversations because they gave me a sense of human connection when my husband wasn't around. Then one night, things changed. It was a stormy evening, with rain beating against the windows and thunder rolling in the distance. Danny was gone for days on another trip, leaving just Richard and me in the house. He had just made fresh coffee and I was about to excuse myself after dinner when he asked if I wanted to stay a little while longer. The storm outside felt like an invitation to stay, so I said yes, great for the company, but this time the conversation was different. He asked me questions about my life before meeting Danny that he had never asked before, so I told him about my early years, my small town, roots, and my parents. He listened carefully, and I felt like I was opening up in ways I hadn't before, possibly inappropriate. Richard was more than just my father-in-law. He was someone who made me feel seen and appreciated in a way that was painfully lacking from my life. At one point, it felt like I was back with an old friend who understood me at my core. Our hands touched just a light accidental brush, and I pulled mine back in shock, but I didn't leave. Instead, a heavy-handed silence fell between us, and I should have excused myself immediately. After that night, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed and that what had happened between Richard and me was a brief moment, an accidental brush of hands, or a look that lingered too long, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The connection we shared had planted a seed of something forbidden, something that clung to my thoughts even when I didn't want it to. Looking back on our marriage, I can see the warning signs, the thin line I was walking, but in that moment I ignored them. Lost in the comfort he offered the connection I'd been craving to that moment. Tried to ignore it in the hopes that my feelings would subside, but every time I saw Richard, they returned strong and unmistakable. Richard didn't make things any easier though. He continued to show me kindness and subtle attention that always seemed to go beyond simple concern. He would check in on me in small ways, like bringing me tea when he saw me in the study or offering to help with household chores when he saw I was feeling overwhelmed. I knew these gestures were simple acts of kindness, but the way he looked at me occasionally left me wondering. When he asked me to go for a walk with him one evening while Danny was still out of town and we were alone in the house, I initially told myself it wasn't appropriate, but part of me was drawn to the idea of fresh air and companionship in the stillness of the evening, so I accepted. As we walked down the path from the house to the beach, the sky was painted with hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, and we discussed everything and nothing. He told me stories about his early years that I had never heard before, stories that made him feel less like Danny's father and more like a friend. He told me about a trip he took to Italy when he was young and how he fell in love with the art, the architecture, and the history. I listened enchantedly, soaking in his words, and the way his voice softened as he talked about the things he loved. After a while, we paused. He turned to face me, his gaze lingering in a way that made my breath catch. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the silent work he was fighting within himself, and just as I was missing, he murmured something in a voice that was barely audible over the sound of the waves. I could feel him standing close, the warmth of his presence so close it was almost palpable. He was looking out at the waves crashing against the shore. He shared my feelings that he was struggling with emotions that he was unable to control. I wanted to take a step back to defuse the situation and draw a line that would prevent us from crossing into something from which we would never be able to escape, but instead I just stood there expecting the moment to pass without either of us moving. There was a brief silence that felt heavy with unsaid words, and then he turned away with obvious effort, breaking the spell. "We should get back," he said, his voice tight as if it took all of his strength to pull himself. We parted ways at the house, each of us withdrawing to our own rooms, but the tension from that moment followed me. It was as if the walls were charged with it, as if every corner and shadow held a piece of that unspoken desire. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in my head, unable to get rid of the longing that simmered beneath my skin. I forced a smile and nodded, pretending that my heart wasn't racing and that my skin wasn't touched. The next few days were agonizing. I tried to avoid Richard as much as possible, but the more I tried, the more I found myself thinking about him. I was losing control, allowing my emotions to control my actions in a way that was both exciting and terrifying. The guilt kept reminding me that I was betraying not only my husband but also the foundation of my marriage, but there was a selfish, desperate part of me that wouldn't let go. Then came the night that changed everything, when Danny had just left on another business trip, a last-minute meeting that would keep him out of town for a week. As he packed, he gave me a quick, absent-minded peck on the cheek before leaving. Already preoccupied with work, I watched him go, feeling the same emptiness and loneliness that always accompanied his absence, but this time there was something different, an excitement that made my heart race knowing that Richard and I would be alone that evening after dinner. He poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat down at the table, the conversation flowing as usual, but tonight there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of us acknowledged. As the evening wore on, the wine started to loosen our words, making us both bolder and more vulnerable. We talked about everything, the dreams we had set aside, the regrets we held close, the moments that had changed, and I found myself alone in the kitchen. The only sound in the house was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Formed us, there was an unvarnished honesty between us, a sense of an asterisk Macy that was both thrilling and forbidden. At one point, our conversation changed, and he looked at me with a piercing gaze. His hand reached across the table and rested on mine, warm and familiar but charged with something much deeper. I realized then that we were standing on the precipice of something irrevocable that, if we allowed it, would change everything, and I wanted to pull my hand away to keep from falling. "I know," I whispered, I don't want to hurt you or Danny, but but his words broke off, and he looked away, struggling to contain the emotions he'd been keeping buried. Without thinking, I reached up and cupped his face, guiding his gaze back to mine. All other things vanished, including the guilt, the fear, and the consequences. Only we remained, and our connection and the desire we had been trying so hard to ignore were there. Our faces were so close that I could feel his breath warm against my skin. Then, before I could stop myself, our lips met in a tentative, soft kiss that spoke of both longing and restraint. It was only a whisper of a touch, but it was enough to ignite something deep inside of me that I couldn't control, so I withdrew my heart. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, so we just sat there, both of us struggling with the weight of what we'd just done. I knew in that moment that there was no turning back, that a line had been crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. Looking back, I can see the signs of the times when I could have stopped, when I could have walked away. The reality of what we just did crashed over me, and the look in his eyes was one of equal shock and longing, reflecting everything I was feeling. But instead, I allowed myself to be carried away by a desire I thought I could conceal and a feeling I thought I could control. By doing this, I started a chain of events that would destroy the life I had built and the marriage I had vowed to protect. After that kiss, I felt the weight of what I had done pressing down on me. I wanted to tell myself that it had been a mistake, a slip, a one-time decision gone wrong, but every time I tried to do so, I knew I was lying, and I could sense that the line had been crossed and that there was no turning back. After that, I tried my best to pretend nothing had changed. I moved around the house as if I were the same Mia who had once lived with certainty and purpose. I tried to smile and act as bright as I had been, as committed to my work as hopeful, but the truth kept coming back to me every day, reminding me that I was no longer that woman. Instead, I was someone who had betrayed the person I loved the most, and I didn't know how to live with that knowledge. Danny came home from his business trip happy and full of tales about his meetings without me realizing it. I listened, nodded, and laughed when I should have, and I went through the motions of being a supportive wife, but every moment I spent with him served as a reminder of my betrayal and the terrible truth I was concealing, one that could destroy the life we had built. Richard also pretended nothing had happened, acting friendly and courteous as if we had never crossed that line. Part of me hated him because he was so good at pretending while I was drowning in guilt, but another part of me was thankful. I was relieved that he wasn't bringing it up or making us face the seriousness of what we'd done. The silence between us served as a shield, a thin barrier that kept the truth hidden, but the guilt persisted. It was evident in every glance, every brief moment of eye contact, and the stolen looks I saw him give me when he thought no one was looking. It haunted me, an implacable pain that gnawed my soul, making it impossible to forget, impossible to move on, and then one day everything fell apart. I was in the shower attempting to wash away the shame that stuck to me like a second skin. When I heard the bathroom door open, I froze, the water falling on me as I registered the sound. I thought it might be Danny coming home unexpectedly, but then I saw Richard's silhouette through the steaming glass. My heart was racing, and I was feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. "Richard," I managed to speak, barely a whisper, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his presence filling the tiny bathroom with the tension between us crackling like static. I should have told him to go, should have turned away, but I was stuck in the pull of his eyes, in the unspoken connection that had brought us together in the first place. He reached out and touched my cheek, his touch warm against my damp skin. I closed my eyes, feeling the guilt, shame, and desire rising inside of me. He leaned in his breath, his presence overwhelming and suffocating for a moment, losing us in that forbidden closeness, that dangerous and asterisk Macy that neither. I stood there, my body shaking, my mind racing, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a vice. After he left, I sank to the shower floor, the water cascading over me as I tried to process the enormity of what I'd done. The guilt was unbearable, the physical ache made it difficult to breathe, and I had crossed every boundary I'd ever known. All of us had the strength to resist, but as quickly as it had begun, it was over. He pulled away his face, a mask of regret and understanding, and he left without saying anything. There was no turning back now that I realized the true cost of my actions. I had allowed myself to be led by vulnerability and a need for connection, and in doing so, I had compromised everything I held dear, failed my husband, and the life we had built together. I had betrayed every value I had held dear. I had broken the trust of the man I loved, and there was no way to undo the damage. That remains with you as a continual reminder of the line you should never have crossed. Thinking back on it, I wish I could have been stronger and maintained the boundaries I once held in such high regard, but I allowed myself to blur those lines, allowing my vulnerability and loneliness to cloud my judgment. In doing so, I destroyed something priceless, something that no one reading this could ever replace. I hope my story can serve as a warning that there will always be times when you feel weak and tempted to turn to. Places we shouldn't be strong are important, but when they happen, it's important to keep in mind the consequences and realize that once boundaries are crossed, the damage is irreversible. Above all, you should have the strength to uphold your values even when it's difficult because, in the end, what defines us are the decisions we make, the boundaries we respect, and the loyalty we uphold.